Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in the Chinese economy, and specifically to talk about the liquidation of more property developers. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that Evergrande, which is the company that has the most debt out of all of the Chinese property developers, at the time that it went into financial difficulty, it had racked up $328 billion worth of debt. And in January, a Hong Kong court finally issued a liquidation notice against the company. So Evergrande is now formally going through a liquidation process. And what that's triggered is a whole host of other liquidation proceedings against other Chinese developers. So in today's video, I want to talk about what's happening with Country Garden, which between 2017 and 2022 was the largest property developer in the whole of China. It overtook Evergrande for that position. And Country Garden currently has over 3,100 active developments, which is more than 4 times the amount that Evergrande has. And that covers around 128 million square meters of building space. And just to put that into perspective, that equates to more than 2 times the size of Manhattan. And this is spread over many, many different cities in China. 60% of all of those developments have been pre-sold. So Chinese people have actually bought them in advance of them being built. And this is one of the main problems in the Chinese developer market, that a lot of people in China have actually taken on debt. Chinese banks will provide you with a mortgage against a future purchase, which I don't think happens anywhere else in the world. So what that means is that you can end up with a large amount of debt that you're having to pay every single month. And your apartment hasn't even been constructed yet. So that puts you into financial difficulty at the same time as your developer might be going bankrupt or becoming illiquid. And that's exactly the situation for most of these developers. So we'll talk about what's happening with Country Garden, the liquidation proceedings that have now been brought against that company, which potentially could force it into liquidation in the same way as happened to Evergrande recently. We'll also talk about what's happening with Vanke, which is one of the other biggest developers in China right now, which is currently struggling to refinance a loan that's due to mature on the 11th of March. Originally, it was talking to a group of Chinese banks, but those banks are becoming more reluctant to actually provide the debt as a result of a recent downgrade on the credit side of things for Vanke. And then we'll also talk about what Deutsche Bank is looking to do against Shimao, one of the other big developers in China. It's potentially bringing liquidation proceedings, which will be the first time that Deutsche has done that. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the implications of this rash of liquidations is going to be for the Chinese property market and what that means for the Chinese economy. But before we get started on all of that, once again, I'd like to say thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you so much. You're really helping to keep the channel going. Your support is really important and I really appreciate it. This chart shows China's top 25 property developers as of 2022, so the height of the market before everything really started to collapse. And the size of the circles here relates to the turnover of that company. And the bigger the circle, the bigger the turnover. And the circles are shown in 3 different colours here. The grey circles show the property developers that are owned directly by the Chinese state. The dark green circles show the private property developers. And the light green circles show those companies that were in default in 2022. And as you can see, 2 years ago, only 3 out of the top 25 property developers were in default. And the biggest of all of the property developers in that year was Country Garden, which turned over more than 350 billion Chinese yuan. So this was a major player. And as I mentioned at the start of today's video, it was building over 3,100 different developments. And those developments each consist of thousands of different properties. So we are talking a huge amount of real estate here. Now this chart shows the same 25 property developers, but plots them on a different chart, which measures the amount of liabilities that that company had on its balance sheet, so basically the amount of debt, and that's shown by the axis across the bottom of this chart. So the further to the right you are, the more liabilities you have. And the left-hand axis of this chart shows whether or not the company was making a profit or making a loss. And the line across the middle is the break-even point. So the companies that are in the top half were making a profit, the companies in the bottom half were making a loss. And if we look at where Country Garden was situated, you can see that it was the company that had the most debt out of the top 25 developers back in 2022. And at that point, Evergrande had dropped out of the top 25. And you can also see that at that point, Country Garden had fallen into a loss. So it was no longer making profit. And obviously the combination of a huge amount of debt and making losses is a nightmare scenario, because that means that you're not generating any surplus cash flow, which you need to service your debt and also to make repayments. So the writing was always on the wall for Country Garden back in 2022 because of where it was situated in terms of the amount of debt it had and the losses that it was incurring. And if you look at the other circles on this chart, you can see that the three companies that were already in default at that point were loss-making. There were two other companies also making losses, and then we had a whole host of companies that were sitting at or around the break-even point. Now, I don't have an updated version of this chart for 2024, but if we did, there is a strong likelihood that all of these companies would now be sitting below the break-even point and would be making losses. And there's also a good chance that a lot of them would have moved further to the right in terms of increasing the amount of liabilities and debt that they have. And as I mentioned at the start of today's video, Country Garden has now received a winding up order. It's facing a liquidation petition in the Hong Kong courts. The first liquidation hearing is scheduled for May the 17th at Hong Kong's High Court, as a result of Evercredit Limited filing a winding up petition against Country Garden for failing to make payments on a term loan facility of around $204 million, plus accrued interest to the lender. Now, this is a really interesting development because when all of the other property developers started to default on their debt, Country Garden was put forward as one of the shining examples of a business that was prepared to sit down with all of its lenders, work out a restructuring program, and find a way to keep trading. So it was seen as being the new breed of property developer that could manage the amount of debt that it had. However, over the last year or so, the confidence factor in Country Garden has started to fall. And that can be seen in this chart, which plots the value of the Country Garden bonds. And what this chart shows is that back in March 23, Country Garden's 2024 8% dollar bond was trading for around 83 cents on the dollar, and its 2026 7.25% dollar bond was trading for around 63 cents. However, as you can see, there was a huge crash in the value of those bonds in June, July and August 23, and they are now trading for around 10 cents on the dollar. So what that means is that if you were one of the original lenders of those bonds and you provided 100 cents on the dollar, you would now be looking at a 90% write-off of all of your debt. So that really gives you an indication as to how much the confidence has disappeared in terms of the future trading potential for Country Garden. Everybody is expecting this to result in a huge write-off. Another one of China's major property developers, Vanke Real Estate, is now also facing the prospect of liquidation. As we saw from this chart, back in 2022, Vanke was the third largest property developer behind Country Garden and Poly Development. And over the last 12 months, concerns have started to rise in China about the future viability of the company. And the company's share price has fallen significantly over the last 12 months. And in November 2023, Moody's, the rating agency, cut the rating on Vanke's debt to junk status. They basically downgraded it to the lowest level possible, which indicates that holders of that debt are going to struggle to get repaid on it. And as a result of all of these factors, there are now rising concerns that Vanke is not in a position to be able to refinance $630 million worth of debt that's maturing in March. Now, normally in these circumstances, what would happen is that when you have a large amount of debt that's coming up for repayment, you would just find new people to take on that debt issue you with new debt and repay the old debt with your new debt. But obviously, when there are concerns about your future viability and your credit rating is falling, the options in terms of finding banks and institutions to give you that new debt start to narrow down. And that's the situation that Vanke finds itself in right now. It was originally talking to a club of Chinese banks who apparently were going to put together the deal to replace the 630 million. However, that's now under question. We don't know whether or not Vanke will be able to refinance that debt, and if it doesn't, then that company could also be facing liquidation proceedings. And this is once again a domino impact, because what we're seeing is contagion spreading all across the sector. As more and more banks start to encounter losses on their Chinese debt, they're worried about advancing any new money, and therefore it becomes very difficult for companies like Vanke to be able to find those facilities to repay everything as and when they mature. So this is now becoming a really big crisis for many of the property developers in China. When the property crisis first started to unfold back in 2022, one of the developers that defaulted on its debt first was a company called Shimao, which had around $11.7 billion worth of overseas debt. And that's the problem for property developers, that when they have overseas debt, they have to deal with overseas institutions and the holders of those bonds. When you've just got all of your debt contained within Chinese banks, then there is a possibility of being able to just kick the can further down the road if the Chinese state instructs all of those banks to roll over the debt and just carry on lending. However, when you've got international bondholders and banks, that doesn't happen. You have to start negotiating with them. And so Shimao was one of the first companies that had to sit down with its bondholders and try to renegotiate some sort of deal. And that process has been going on for more than 2 years. And Shimao recently put forward a proposal whereby they want 7 billion of the 11.7 billion to be effectively extended into a new 9-year loan. So basically kicking the can down the road for that 7 billion, because obviously they don't have anything like 7 billion of cash, and they can't find new debt because nobody will give them any new facilities. So really, from the bondholders' point of view, at this point, they didn't really have much choice other than to agree to those terms. However, it's now been announced that Deutsche Bank is considering bringing liquidation proceedings against Shimao. A recent press report said that the German bank, which is one of the creditors of Shimao, is looking to file a petition in March after it found the developer's debt restructuring terms unacceptable. Now, you may be sitting there thinking, well, why would Deutsche Bank do that? Why wouldn't they just agree to the deal that's put on the table? And the reason is that there comes a point where you want to draw a line under this. Because if Deutsche Bank agree to extending the loan for another 9 years, all it's going to do is sit on the Deutsche Bank's books for the next 9 years. And then at some point in the future, somebody else is going to have to come around the table and talk to Shimao, who realistically probably won't have $7 billion even in 9 years' time. So basically, Deutsche are saying enough is enough. We don't want to carry this on forever. We're drawing a line under it. And actually, by forcing the company to go through some sort of liquidation process, there is a chance that you could get some sort of recovery. You might actually get something back on your dollar of debt. The reasons for the problems in the property market in China are shown by these 3 charts, which plot property sales by floor area, property investment, and funds raised by developers dating back to 1999. So if we start off by looking at the funds raised by developers, and this is a combination of debt and equity, but the majority of the funds raised by property developers in China over the last 25 years has been debt. And what this chart shows is that between 1999 and 2007, there was an explosion in the amount of funds raised by developers, and the year-on-year percentage increases in the majority of those years was between 20 and 30%. Banks literally couldn't get debt out of the door quick enough. They were signing off on billions and billions of dollars of lending to property developers who were using that money to run around the country building as many apartments as possible. Now, there was a brief pause in the feeding frenzy in 2008 when the global financial crisis hit. However, there was still a percentage increase in that year. There was not a fall in terms of new debt being provided to developers. And between 2010 and 2021, there were year-on-year increases in the amount of debt and equity being given to developers. This was a no-lose gamble from the bank's point of view, or so they thought. However, if you look at what happened in 2022 and 2023, you can see there was a sharp reversal, and the amount of funds raised by developers in 2022 fell by almost 30%, and there was a further fall of around 13% in 2023. If we now look at what happened to property investment over the same period, you can see that between 1999 and 2021, there was a rapid increase in the amount of funds being invested into the property sector in China. And this was because everybody loved property. Property was seen as being a no-risk gamble. You bought a property, it went up in price, you made a profit, and therefore you wanted to buy another property. And many investors bought multiple properties in different cities all across China. This was fueling the growth in the Chinese economy. Everybody wanted to be involved in property. However, if you look at what's happened in 2022 and 2023, you can see that there's been a reduction in the amount of money being invested into the property sector. It fell by around 10% in 22 and almost 9% in 2023. And that's as a result of the fact that prices have started to fall, and also there's been a huge loss of confidence in the sector as a result of the failure of many of the property developers, and also the failure to build out the apartments that people had paid for in advance. And if we now have a look at what happened to property floor sales, you can see that between 1999 and 2007, there was a rapid increase in the volume of property being sold. It did fall in 2008 as a result of the global financial crisis. However, there was a swift bounce back in 2009 when sales increased by more than 40%. Sales continued to increase between 2011 and 2013. There was a reversal in 2014 when we saw a slowdown in the global economy. However, there was once again a bounce back in 2015, and that continued right through until 2022, when we saw a fall in property sales by floor area of around 25%, and that was followed with a further fall of 7.1% in 2023. And these three charts really provide a good summary as to why all the property developers in China are in such difficulty right now, because between 1999 and 2021, they built up huge amounts of debt and became completely reliant upon never-ending amounts of debt. But unfortunately, all of that debt stopped overnight in 2022 and 2023. So developers haven't been able to access the funds that they need to build out all of the apartments that they pre-sold. And at the same time as that's happened, the level of investment has gone into reverse, and sales have also fallen dramatically. So this is a perfect storm from the property developer's point of view. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's happening with some of the really big developers in China is really interesting right now. Obviously, Evergrande was the poster boy for all of these companies. It was the one that made the headlines first. It had the most debt, over $300 billion of debt. And in January, the company was finally forced into liquidation. It's going through a process right now. Now, how long that process takes remains to be seen. It is probably going to take years. It could even take a decade or more to unfold because the company has so many different developments and so many different arms to it. And there's also the question as to whether or not China will agree to anything that's decided in the Hong Kong courts. Obviously, the international bondholders can petition through Hong Kong, and those courts are independent from China, so they gave the ruling of a liquidation against Evergrande. But whether or not any of the Chinese companies involved comply with any of the orders, whether any money ever leaves China, is a big question. Probably not is the answer to that. So realistically, the bondholders will be looking at overseas assets. And from Evergrande's point of view, they do have some assets, but nowhere near enough to pay off all of their debt. So the bondholders are not likely to get back much, if anything, because costs tend to eat up a lot of the value in these claims. You have to pay all of the lawyers and accountants and everybody else involved, and at the end of the process, they generally get paid first, and so it's unlikely that there'll be anything left. But I think what a lot of the bondholders wanted to do with Evergrande was to prove the point of principle, to actually say enough is enough. You can't keep coming to the international markets, borrowing money and then never paying it back and not having a liquid company and get away with it. We have to prove that this can't go on forever. And that's really what's happened. And what we're seeing from today's video is that the other major property developers in China are now facing this same process. So Country Garden, which was the biggest developer between 2017 and 2022, is now facing a winding up petition, a liquidation order. So it could go down the same road as Evergrande. And also we've got now potential action against Shimao and Vanke. So these are some of the biggest names that we've been talking about over the last few years. And what this means is that these companies will never be able to raise any more money internationally. So even if the property market in China did turn around, if there was a major bounce back, those companies wouldn't be able to raise internationally because they're going through these winding up orders and are insolvent. But also I think it sends a warning signal to all of the other property developers in China that it is going to be extremely difficult to tap any debt from the international markets. And what we saw recently was HSBC announced in their annual results that they had to include a $3 billion write-off as a result of losses that they'd incurred in one of their Chinese subsidiaries. And that related predominantly to what's happening in the property sector in China. But really where we are right now in terms of this process is right at the start, because the majority of these large property developers haven't really gone through the restructuring process fully yet. They've been talking to their lenders, they've been deferring and trying to put everything off and delaying things, but nobody has actually agreed a deal with all of their different providers because there isn't really many deals to be done. When you look at what's happening with the companies, most of them are still incurring losses. They're not making a profit, and therefore it's very difficult to argue the case to roll over billions of dollars of debt to a company that's actually making losses. But I think where we are right now is the tipping point. The lenders and the holders of this debt have decided that enough is enough. And as soon as one company like Evergrande goes into liquidation, there is a call for all of the other companies to follow suit, to be forced into the courts, to break up the company and give back as much as they can, even if it's a very small amount, because it draws a line under it and everybody can move on. And that's really where we are in the cycle. Lots of institutions have decided that they want to come to the end of this process. So we're starting to see a raft of liquidations hitting the Hong Kong courts. And I think over the next 12 to 18 months, we will see more of them. And it'll be really interesting to see what the Chinese authorities do, whether or not these companies do comply with the orders that are issued by Hong Kong, or whether they're ignored and China just decides to crack on itself and to ignore the international debt markets and to self-fund its property market over the next 10 to 25 years. And let's not forget that the property sector in China equates to around 25% of the economy. So if that sector continues to go into decline, it's going to drag down the whole Chinese economy. And China's hopes and aspirations of becoming the biggest economy in the world are starting to fade. It's unlikely, given what's happening with the property sector, that it will overtake the USA at any time in the near future. But if we do see that sector continuing to implode, it could drag down the whole of the Chinese economy over the course of the next 3 to 5 years. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.